If you talk to any background artist from any of the current generation of animated filmmakers, they'll ask them for their favorite movies. Bambi is going to be at the top of the list because of its painterly style.
The talent is awe-inspiring on all levels. I don't ever think up until that time they had done backgrounds like that. To have the guts to say we're not going to draw every leaf, we're going to do impressionism.
The idea was not just to kind of depict nature, but kind of go for a feeling that you get when you're in the woods.
When they were going to work on Bambi, Walt sent a team of photographers up to Maine to the forest, and they made studies of the forest and the forest creatures.
And he came back with hundreds of pictures. And we were very much enthused with that type of thing, but it didn't work. We were doing too much detail.
And then after Walt looked at millions of leaves and trees, he was getting a little discouraged about how we're going to do this thing.
Each of the great Disney features have certain artists who would kind of set the tone or the keynote them in a way. And on Bambi, it was Tyrus Wong. It was a Chinese artist who came to America as a young man, as a boy actually, had studied art here, and he brought a Chinese aesthetic to his paintings.
Because I got married. Chinese, when you get married, well, you have to support wife, right? So I said, well, I talked to my wife.
And so she asked him, said, why don't you go over to Disney studio and ask for a job? So they took him in and put him to work as an in-betweener and training to eventually become an animator.
Well, in-betweening, you're doing the drawings in between the main drawings, and it becomes very repetitive, and it can drive you crazy sometimes.
And boy, when I did that, when I get home, my eyes would feel like it ready to drop out of the socket. It's constantly flipping the paper, and I think I was there for about a month or so. So I finally found out that they were doing Bambi. I'm mainly a landscape painter anyway, so I work up the tiny sketches and bring it in and show it to them. Tom Coderick. He said, gee, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm doing in-betweening. He said, maybe we put you in the wrong department.
Walt had a wonderful way of organizing and finding talent, and a typical Walt Disney discovery by seeing his work. It was sometime later that we realized he had this marvelous color sense, and that you'll see in the film itself.
So that's how eventually the style of Bambi came about. Tyrus Wong just needed a job in the Big Depression.
What Tyrus Wong brought to the art direction is just absolutely stunning. And he had thousands of small-scale and large-scale sketches that were very lyrical and had that poetry that Walt wanted.
When you take a step back from the story, which is hard to do with Bambi, but if you can, take a step back, turn off the sound, and just start looking at every image, you will be so stunned at how every scene is like this exquisite painting of nature. Not realistic, in fact, very stylized, but it represents that feeling of being in the forest.
It's the forest of your dreams and the forest you experience rather than the forest you actually see. And that's very much the aesthetic in Chinese landscape paintings.
At that time, Chinese influence just came natural with me.
We realized the simplicity of Ty's backgrounds, you could still get all the color you needed with simple forms. Then the main characters would show up beautifully in front of that.
I think Walt was fortunate to have Tyrus Wong working there to come up with that concept.
Although he's a very modest man and doesn't realize it, even today there are young artists who still look to him as one of the great talents ever to work in that area of design.
It was transcendent, it really was. It's just absolutely beautiful and very unlike anything that we had ever done before at this studio.
All of us, when we start out, we look to, what the masters did, and that's what, they're a bunch of masters. They paved the way. And so to see what Tyrus has done, and it's giving you inspiration to kind of branch out yourself and explore new areas that haven't been done before, because that's what these guys did.
How much do you respect a stroke of brilliance? And I think that Tyrus was one of these painters that kind of come in and left his mark.
It never dawned on me that that's an influence, that, you know.
Walt Disney had this thing he called the plausible impossible. He said our movies don't have to be real, they have to be plausible, and yet what we're creating on the screen is completely impossible. And Bambi's a great example of that. Deer don't talk, and skunks and bunnies don't talk, but they do in Bambi, and this world seems very real and very alive. Big part of that is the backgrounds, the atmosphere, and the visual effects that go on when you're seeing the film.
You've got flowers growing, you've got leaves blowing in the fall, and then you've got the forest fire. All of these things that happen out in the natural wild, you have to recreate those.
And what people don't realize sometimes is all that had to be drawn. All that had to be drawn frame by frame in exactly the same way that the characters had to be drawn.
There was also a lot of development going on in the camera department and doing optical effects.
Walt was always had experiments going on in smaller films that he could adapt to the larger films. On the old mill painting, they established the effects of the ripple glass.
Ripple glass was optically ground glass that had a pattern to it, and when you move that under the lens over artwork, you got this ripple water effect. You created these beautiful moments in water. They also used ripple glass for the fire, and it really created some heat distortions.
The effects were so groundbreaking. When there's snow, you couldn't just animate snowflakes by just hand draw them. They did all kinds of experimentations by dropping cornflakes and filming that in slow motion and then bleaching it or just making it look white, and that was the right effect, sort of these cornflakes falling.
Time magazine talked about a Disney artist being arrested for lying on his back on the sidewalk, staring up and not wanting to be moved. I don't know if that really happened or not, but the point is it could have really happened if he was a special effects guy, because what he wanted to know was, what do the raindrops look like as they come toward your eyeballs? Because we want to put that into the Little April Showers number.
They filmed live-action rain on a soundstage against a black background, and we're still using those film elements 60 years later. We used them in Little Mermaid, we used them in Pocahontas, in Lion King. And so there's a great sense of history and of paying homage to those early visual effects artists.
Walt and his team were always looking for ways of creating dimension in their work. And you really saw this in a big way in the build-up to Snow White. They knew that to sustain a feature-length animated film, it couldn't just be a cartoon that was long. It had to actually have production values. And one of the things they tested in a short called The Old Mill was the multiplane camera. So it was taking a background painting, and instead of painting it on one piece of paper, they would break it off on several sheets of glass, maybe 4 or 5 deep. And so if you had a farm on a country road, you would see a piece of the fence and the mailbox, and on the next piece of glass you would see a piece of the road, and then on the back you'd see the barn. And when you put a camera there and shot through all those layers of glass, you would get a really interesting feeling of perspective.
If you look at that multiplane camera shot, it takes you deep into the forest in the very first sequence of Bambi. The main thing it did was it gave the illusion of depth. And Walt wanted you to see depth because that's the way he saw that forest.
There were shots that are just vistas that have so much depth you feel like you can just reach in and walk into that frame.
It's great, and it's all part of the storytelling. All those effects, just like every other aspect of the film, the painting and the design and the animation, it's all that work that they put into that that really made it pay off and make it such a great piece of art.
Well, the result is it's up there on the screen. You can see it, and you've been there before. You know the whole forest.
We look at Bambi and say, wow, that has all the romance of a beautiful old handwritten letter or a beautiful hand-done painting. And we see that. We see the humanity up on the screen in every way, and I think that's part of the reason we react to it the way we do.